Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we cut through the noise and get straight to the insights.
Great to be here.
Today, we're embarking on a journey into the life and ideas of one of the 20th century's most profoundly influential and maybe most polarizing economists, Milton Friedman.
Yeah, polarizing is definitely the word. Just to give you a sense of his impacts, Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, he famously said that in his youth, Friedman was almost a devil figure.
Wow, devil figure.
Yeah. But later, Summers conceded the issue was, well, more nuanced.
That shift right there from devil to nuance, that really sets the stage for what we're trying to do today, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. I mean, picture this guy, described as rumpled and unpretentious, standing barely 5 feet tall, peering through thick glasses with an expression of amusement and wonder.
Doesn't sound too threatening.
Not at all. Yet this unassuming figure, he inspired both awe and rage.
Awe and rage, that's quite the combo.
It really is. We're talking picket lines from Wisconsin all the way to Stockholm. And this is pretty amazing, even in his granddaughter's nursery school.
At his granddaughter's nursery school? That's intense.
Seriously intense. It shows the kind of visceral reaction he provoked.
It's truly remarkable, isn't it, how one economist could become such a lightning rod. You hear the name Friedman, and it conjures up, like, not just a person, but an entire constellation of ideas.
Exactly. And his influence, it seeped way beyond academic journals. It got firmly embedded in pop culture.
Right. Like Alex P. Keaton on Family Ties, his hero was Milton Friedman.
A classic example. Or think more recently, Joe Biden's 2020 campaign. He actually declared Milton Friedman isn't running the show anymore.
When a presidential candidate name-checks you like that, decades after your peak influence, that says something.
It says a lot about his cultural footprint. Most economists, they don't get that kind of recognition.
And that footprint, that legacy, that's precisely what we want to unpack in this deep dive.
Yeah, our mission here is to explore this really complex figure and his enduring legacy. We'll trace how Friedman, quite meticulously, crafted the intellectual consensus behind free markets and limited government.
Ideas that really powered 20th century American conservatism.
Absolutely. He advised figures like Barry Goldwater, influenced Ronald Reagan pretty heavily, and Margaret Thatcher over in the UK, too.
But his ideas, as you'll find out, they weren't just stuck in one political box. They sort of transcended those partisan divides, didn't they?
They really did. They shaped thinking and policy across the globe. London, Santiago in Chile, even Shanghai. His reach was enormous.
So if you've ever had taxes withheld from your paycheck, or maybe wondered about the Federal Reserve and its power, or even if you've argued about universal basic income,
then you've brushed up against Milton Friedman. His ideas are woven into the fabric of these debates.
We'll delve into the origins of what were once considered, frankly, crazy ideas.
Like floating exchange rates, letting currencies just find their own level in the market.
Yeah, or the all-volunteer military instead of a draft. These things seem normal now, but they were radical back then.
And Friedman was championing them. We'll trace his whole intellectual journey from being seen as this kind of oddball misfit in academic circles
to becoming this truly dominant force in economics. Our goal isn't just to tell you what he believed.
Right. We want you to understand why it mattered then, and crucially, why it might still matter for the burning economic issues we're facing today.
Okay, so let's rewind. Let's go back to the very beginning, his formative years, a long way from the big policy debates.
Right. He was born into an immigrant Jewish family back in 1912. His parents, Sol and Sarah Friedman, they settled in Rahway, New Jersey in 1913.
And what did they do?
His father was a jobber, basically, a middleman, reselling merchandise. His mother ran a dry goods store.
So not the typical sweatshop or tenement store you sometimes hear about immigrants back then?
No, not really. It was more of a small-town boyhood, a different kind of experience, maybe a bit more prosperous than some.
And what's fascinating is how these childhood experiences almost seem to foreshadow his later economic thinking.
It really seems that way.
Yeah.
He was apparently a real whiz kid academically at Rahway High, edited the school paper, that kind of thing. But it was his little businesses, his entrepreneurial ventures that really stand out. They gave him these early lessons in market dynamics.
Like what?
Well, we're talking about him selling green ties and white socks to freshmen.
Huh. Classic supply and demand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Identifying a need, filling it for profit, just like his dad, the jobber. He also ran a used book business.
Okay.
Which, maybe unsurprisingly, annoyed the official campus bookstore.
Why?
So you see early competition, market friction right there.
And he started a summer school.
A remedial summer school, yeah.
Yeah.
These weren't just kids messing around. They were like little real-world economics labs for him.
And he internalized these lessons, didn't he? Like the famous no such thing as a free lunch idea.
Precisely. He got that when he was waiting tables in college. He realized that a supposedly free meal wasn't actually free.
Mm.
Well, it was a form of compensation, right? Which probably meant he was earning a lower cash wage than he could have otherwise.
A simple concept, but profound. Learn through just doing the work.
Exactly. And these early insights, they became incredibly relevant when he went to Rutgers University from 1929 to 1932.
Right, smack in the middle of the Great Depression deepening.
Yeah, the timing couldn't have been more impactful. During his time there, farm income basically got cut in half. A quarter of the workforce, unemployed, and then this huge wave of bank failures in 33, right after he graduated.
The scale of that crisis is just hard to fathom today.
Immense suffering, economic chaos. And for young Friedman, these weren't just abstract problems in a textbook.
No, they spark these huge, urgent questions for him, right?
Absolutely. How do we get out of this depression?
Yeah.
How do we reduce unemployment? What explains this crazy paradox of having so much need, but all these unused resources, factories idle, people jobless?
These weren't just intellectual puzzles. They were, as the source says, the great questions of the age.
They really were.
Yeah.
And the existing economic theories just didn't seem to have good answers.
He had some key mentors at Rutgers who shaped him, though.
Definitely. Arthur Burns was a big one, later Fed chair, actually.
Right?
Burns introduced him to Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics. That book became like a lifelong guide for Friedman.
What was special about Marshall?
Marshall blended different approaches, emphasizing how you could measure the force of human motives by looking at prices. For Friedman, this was huge. He saw economics starting to move from philosophy to science.
Wow.
By bringing all these diverse human experiences and choices into one single analytic frame that you could actually test with data.
Interesting. And then there was Frank Knight at Chicago.
Yes, Knight was another massive influence, though Friedman encountered him more formally at Chicago later. Knight taught him this crucial distinction between risk and uncertainty.
Okay, what's the difference there?
Knight said risk is measurable, insurable, like an actuary calculating life insurance odds. That's risk. But uncertainty, that's different. It's unmeasurable, existential, fundamentally unpredictable. Knight argued that real profit, the kind that drives innovation, comes from dealing with this inherent absolute unpredictability, those unique business situations where you can't even calculate probabilities.
That's a deep thought. And Knight had some pretty strong views on people too, right?
Oh, yeah. Knight was famously cynical about human behavior, public discussion. He thought consensus was basically impossible. He even joked that the first serious suggestions for the improvement of the human race would be to have all their tongues removed at birth.
Yikes. Okay, so how did that cynicism shape Friedman?
Well, Knight was deeply skeptical about government planning, about interfering with individual freedom in the name of social planning. This likely really reinforced Friedman's later conviction that markets, with all their flaws, were still better than state control.
Why? Because markets don't rely on perfect planners.
Exactly. Markets harness self-interest. They work despite human imperfections, not because they assume humans are perfect angels or perfectly rational.
Okay, so after Rutgers, he heads to the University of Chicago for graduate studies. And this place becomes a real intellectual crucible for him.
Absolutely. Chicago was where many of his core ideas were forged, right in the heat of that ongoing depression crisis. The economics department there was already questioning the standard thinking of the time.
Because it wasn't explaining the depression well.
Precisely. And there he encountered the quantity theory of money, Lloyd Mintz-Class specifically, Irving Fisher's equation, MVPT.
Right, the famous equation. Break that down for us simply.
Okay, M is money supply, V is velocity, how fast money changes hands,
Right.
P is the price level, and T is the total volume of transactions, like the overall economic activity.
So,
The crucial takeaway for the Chicago folks was this. If you control the money supply, M, and velocity V doesn't change wildly, then prices P and activity T are directly tied to how much money is out there.
so the depression was caused by...
A massive contraction in the money supply, mostly due to all those bank failures. That was their key insight. It wasn't just a business cycle thing. It was fundamentally monetary.
And that led them to advocate for government intervention. That sounds counterintuitive for the Chicago school.
Right. But in the early days, facing deflation, they actually advocated for a vigorous role for the federal government to fight that deflation. They were inspired by Britain going off the gold standard in 1931.
So more government power initially.
Yes. In fact, there was this landmark memo in 1933, co-authored by big Chicago names, Henry Simons, Knight, Aaron, director, Friedman's future brother-in-law.
And what did it say?
It urged a significant expansion of federal power. Really radical stuff for the time. They wanted to boost the price level by 15%, have the federal government basically take over banking and the gold standard, and introduce federal deposit insurance.
Take over banking? Whoa.
It was a direct, almost desperate response to those thousands of bank failures in '33. They saw fractional reserve banking as inherently unstable in that crisis.
So what was their alternative?
They proposed these deposit banks with 100% reserves, totally safe, separate from lending companies that would handle investment. Highly interventionist, born out of crisis. It shows how their thinking evolved later towards less intervention.
Fascinating evolution. So Friedman returns to Chicago after a stint at Columbia, and Knight's influence is even stronger.
Yeah, Knight is ascendant, surrounded by this solid block of Swiss guards. Brilliant economists like George Stigler, Alan Wallace, even a young Paul Samuelson was around then.
And Friedman jumps right into the fray.
Oh, yeah. He immediately took on the British economist Arthur Pigou, a huge name, with this bold attack. It showcased his style, demanding precision, challenging authority, sometimes speaking a, quote, different language than his peers.
Let's unpack that different language. Knight's idea about economics being the one and all-inclusive science of conduct. What did that mean for his students?
It basically turned into what people later called economics imperialism. The belief that the core tools of economics, supply, demand, incentives, marginal analysis, could explain everything.
Everything, like choosing a spouse.
Exactly. Or making a charitable donation. They saw underlying economic logic everywhere. They viewed economics as this powerful, value-free science, ready to conquer any area human choice.
And this was a kind of rebuttal to the New Deal's managed economy ideas.
A very powerful rebuttal. They saw the New Deal as inefficient, based on flawed assumptions. Their approach offered a seemingly more rigorous, scientific alternative.
What about their views on monopoly? Did those change too?
Significantly. Early on, someone like Henry Simons in his positive program for laissez-faire argued economists should guard against monopoly as part of the liberal tradition.
Okay.
But then Aaron, director, Friedman's brother-in-law, started systematically undermining antitrust law, questioning if monopoly was really that pervasive or harmful.
How?
By applying price theory to legal questions, like predatory pricing, he asked. How can a firm sustainably sell below cost to drive out rivals? It doesn't make long-term economic sense in most cases. That work basically founded the field of law and economics.
And others built on that.
Yeah, Warren Nutter, mentored by Friedman, did empirical work suggesting monopoly wasn't automatically generated in free markets, a huge shift from earlier assumptions.
We should also mention Rose Director, Friedman's wife, an economist in her own right.
Absolutely. Brilliant woman, Rose Director Friedman. But she faced huge obstacles as a woman in academia then. Nepotism rules often barred faculty wives from being hired.
A real barrier, forcing a choice between career and family for many women.
Sadly, yes.
Yeah.
But her intellectual partnership with Milton was crucial. They met and married at Chicago. Her independent thinking, her skepticism of Keynesianism, which she got from Knight too, really influenced Milton's later work.
There's also that revealing story about his dissertation on doctors and dentists.
Right, his NBER dissertation from 1945. It became this years-long battle. He argued medicine and dentistry were basically interchangeable for studying income differences, focusing only on price.
Okay.
But what really fueled it was the AMA, the American Medical Association, passing a new citizenship requirement for doctors while he was writing.
And he saw that as
rank discrimination, particularly against Jewish refugee doctors fleeing the Nazis. This solidified his view of the AMA as a bigoted cartel, artificially restricting the supply of doctors to keep incomes high.
So his personal sensitivity to prejudice directly informed his economic analysis of professional licensing.
Exactly. It shows how his personal experiences and his economic ideas were deeply intertwined.
Okay, let's shift to the war years. Friedman worked at the U.S. Treasury during World War II. What was he doing there?
He was advocating for income taxation, interestingly enough, instead of sales taxes.
Yeah.
He saw it as a more socially desirable way to pay for the war. He even advised Treasury Secretary Morgenthau.
So, income tax. That sounds, again, maybe a bit different from his later small government image.
It does. And what's fascinating is that historians later looked back and thought the 1940s were Friedman's Keynesian phase.
Why?
Largely because his analysis back then didn't really focus on monetary forces. Friedman himself even admitted later, I had completely forgotten how thoroughly Keynesian I then was.
Wow. That really shows how much his thinking evolved over time. Monetarism wasn't always his central focus.
Not at all. It became defining later, but wasn't fully formed then.
But he made other contributions during the war too, right? Something about statistics.
Yes, hugely important work. He found his real wartime camaraderie in the Statistical Research Group, the SRG. They consulted on military problems.
And what did they develop?
He and Alan Wallace developed something called sequential analysis, a super colossal statistical test, as they put it.
Meaning?
Okay, imagine testing a new bomb. Instead of needing to, say, detonate 100 bombs for a good accuracy estimate, their method let you get a reliable estimate from maybe just 60. You could stop the test earlier once you hit a certain confidence level.
That must have saved a lot of time and resources.
Hugely valuable for military ordnance. And later, it became vital in things like medical trials. You could stop a trial early if a new drug clearly showed strong benefits or harm.
That's a major contribution. Still, his approach drew some criticism even then.
Yeah, Wesley Mitchell, a senior economist, noted Friedman's lack of interest in an appreciation of non-rational factors that influence economic behavior.
Interesting. That sounds like a critique that would follow him throughout his career, doesn't it? The limits of purely rational models.
It really does foreshadow those later debates. So after the war, Friedman heads back to Chicago. The department was pretty homogeneous, inbred, as the source says.
And he starts teaching money and banking. Didn't you say he wasn't an expert in that?
Exactly. He had no established expertise, but he dove in, found it real fun, a chance to learn a lot, and this became the absolute turning point for his most famous work.
Because this is where he teams up with Anna Schwartz.
Precisely. Anna Schwartz. Brilliant, incredibly systematic researcher. She was tasked with compiling all this historical data on U.S. currency, banking deposits for the NBER. Meticulous work.
And they were influenced by someone else, too.
Yeah, a relatively obscure FDIC economist named Clark Warburton. Warburton consistently argued that the Federal Reserve System has been a failure, a pretty radical view back then.
So that idea gave them an intellectual spark.
A huge spark for their own research into the Fed's history.
Meanwhile, Friedman was also getting into methodological debates at Chicago against the Cowles Commission.
Right. The Cowles Commission folks loved big mathematical general equilibrium models trying to model the whole economy at once.
And Friedman preferred.
He championed what he called portioning, building up theory from discrete pieces of economic activity. He saw it as an engine for the discovery of concrete truth.
Why the clash? He was empirical, they used math. It sounds like they both wanted precision.
But the philosophy was different. Friedman thought Cowles scholars cared too much about abstractness, generality, and mathematical elegance for its own sake.
Like building a beautiful model that didn't quite match reality.
Kind of. He preferred digging into specific data, fine-grained analysis collected in the field. His portioning was like studying individual bricks and beams to understand the building, while Cowles tried to design the perfect blueprint first.
A fundamental difference in how you discover economic truth.
Exactly. It was a major methodological battle. And eventually, Cowles actually moved to Yale. Chicago solidified its more empirical, less abstract approach.
Okay, fast forward to 1951. The Treasury-Fed Accord. You mentioned this was a quiet revolution. Why?
Because it formally freed the Federal Reserve from having to do the Treasury's bidding, like keeping interest rates low to finance government debt. It allowed the Fed to focus primarily on price stability.
So the Fed became a much bigger player on its own.
A truly consequential Washington player, not just an adjunct to the Treasury. And this meant that Friedman and Schwartz's deep dive into monetary history suddenly became incredibly relevant to actual ongoing policy.
Their research wasn't just historical anymore.
Exactly. And interestingly, even people like Wright-Patman, a populist Democrat in Congress who distrusted big banks and money power, he found Friedman and Schwartz's critique of the Fed. Remember Warburton's influence there to be the perfect cudgel for his own arguments against the Fed's power. Strange bedfellows in a way.
Politics makes strange bedfellows. So all this sets the stage for their magnum opus.
Indeed. A Monetary History of the United States, 1867-1960, co-authored with Anna Schwartz, published in 1963. Monumental work.
And its main impact was on understanding the Great Depression.
It permanently altered thinking about it.
Yeah.
It reframed the Depression not as some inevitable capitalist collapse or natural disaster,
But as
as preventable human error,
Hmm.
largely blaming the Federal Reserve's actions, or rather its inactions, especially letting the money supply collapse in the early 30s.
And this view gained traction, even among critics.
Amazingly, yes. Even prominent Keynesians like James Tobin largely accepted their meticulous historical account of what actually happened with the money supply.
That's significant. Did leading economists acknowledge the shift?
Paul Samuelson, arguably the leading Keynesian economist then, conceded that monetary and credit policies have great potency. That was a huge admission. Business Week said it was difficult to find one intellectually prepared to destroy Friedman's arguments.
So a major intellectual victory. Did it have political ripples too?
Immediately, Barry Goldwater, running for president, loved it, praised its academic pedigree and accessible format, plugged it in his column.
And the Fed itself must have been uncomfortable.
Deeply unnerved, they closed ranks, started arguing against any idea of an automatic increase in the money stock that Friedman's work implied. They saw his influence rising.
Friedman wasn't just focused on money, though. He also tackled consumption, right?
Yes, another major contribution, his 1957 book, A Theory of the Consumption Function. And while it's his name on the cover, it really came out of years of intense discussions with Rose, Dorothy Brady, Margaret Reed, often at their summer place in New Hampshire.
Okay, so what was the big idea there? It challenged Keynes again?
Directly challenged Keynes' psychological law, the idea that as your income goes up, you spend more, but proportionally less of the increase.
Right.
Friedman proposed the permanent income hypothesis.
Yeah.
He argued people don't just base their spending and saving on what they earn right now.
They base it
On their long-term expectations of income, what they think they'll earn over their lifetime, their permanent income. You smooth your consumption over time.
And the implication of that is?
It implies the economy is inherently cyclically more stable. People don't drastically cut spending just because of a temporary dip in income or splurge hugely from a temporary windfall. Capitalism had this built-in stabilizer, needing less government tinkering than Keynesians thought.
A fundamental shift in viewing economic stability.
Absolutely. And this ties into another key Friedman concept, rules versus discretion in monetary policy.
He got that from Henry Simons originally.
Yeah, Simons argued for rules, maybe stabilizing the price level via the Treasury, but Friedman and Aaron Director, using Schwartz's data, refined it. They said the rules should target the quantity of money.
A specific, predictable increase in the money supply each year.
Exactly. For Friedman, this wasn't about shrinking government. It was an example of positive liberalism. The state using its unique monopoly in the field of money responsibly to create legible rules of the game for all.
So providing stability and predictability, but without micromanaging.
That was the idea. Connecting thinkers like Keynes, Knight, Simons, even anticipating figures like Volcker. A framework for disciplined, predictable state action in the monetary sphere.
Okay, so Friedman's ideas are developing, gaining traction. Then he starts engaging directly with political power. The Goldwater campaign in '64.
Right. He became a key economic advisor. His book, Capitalism and Freedom, was seen as providing the intellectual backbone for Goldwater's agenda. Things like floating exchange rates, school vouchers, they got a lot of media buzz.
But this period also involved his controversial stance on the Civil Rights Act.
Extremely controversial. Friedman argued on principle that the act was undemocratic. He believed prejudice couldn't really be legislated away, that forcing people to integrate against their will wouldn't work and violated freedom.
His solution was more about economic opportunity.
Yeah, he thought improving the position of African Americans depended mostly on freedom of economic opportunity and on changing attitudes, not laws. He even supported school vouchers if they were used for segregated schools.
Why?
Because he saw the voucher principle itself as sound, regardless of the political outcomes. Freedom of choice was paramount, even if the choices made were ones many found abhorrent.
But critics argue this stance effectively allied libertarian economics
With reactionary populism, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially given Goldwater's appeal in the segregated South. It's a really difficult part of his legacy, highlighting the tension between abstract economic freedom and pressing social justice concerns.
Around the mid-'60s, he gets an even bigger public platform, right? The Newsweek column.
Yes, 1966, he starts alternating columns with Paul Samuelson, the leading Keynesian, a direct public debate between the two dominant economic viewpoints.
And then comes his major address challenging the Phillips curve.
1967 American Economic Association. Huge moment. He directly attacked the Phillips curve, the accepted idea that policymakers faced a stable trade-off. You could choose lower unemployment if you accepted higher inflation, or vice versa.
And Friedman said?
He said, nope. There's always a temporary trade-off. There's no permanent trade-off
Why not?
because of anticipated inflation. Once workers and businesses start expecting inflation, they act on it. Workers demand higher wages to keep up, businesses raise prices preemptively. This expectation itself drives inflation higher, destroying the supposed trade-off. You can't just turn off inflation like a water tap once those expectations set in.
And this prediction turned out to be.
Tragically accurate in the 1970s, with stagflation, high unemployment, and high inflation happening at the same time. It completely broke the standard Phillips curve model and vindicated Friedman's warning.
Even as he's gaining public prominence, he still has influence behind the scenes, like with the Nixon administration.
Yeah, he had this back channel to the Nixon White House, mainly through George Shultz, who'd been his student.
And what was Friedman advising?
Consistently warning against letting the money supply grow too fast. He kept pointing to M1 and M2 growth rates, saying inflation was coming if they didn't slow down.
Interestingly, Nixon's welfare reform proposal, the Family Assistance Plan, FAP, that had echoes of Friedman too.
A direct echo. FAP was basically a version of Friedman's negative income tax, NIT, idea from way back in 1939, providing a minimum income floor through cash payments.
Even though figures like Arthur Burns, Nixon's Treasury Secretary, hated FAP, called it a mad adventure.
Yeah, Burns strongly opposed it. But the core idea, Friedman's NIT concept, was right there in a major presidential initiative. Shows his ideas were percolating everywhere.
And then the 70s brought stagflation, just as Friedman predicted.
Exactly. High unemployment, high inflation. And Arthur Burns, now Fed chair, seemed kind of lost. He couldn't really distinguish between price changes in specific sectors like oil and overall systemic inflation.
So he still thought price controls might work.
Yeah, surprisingly for a business cycle expert, it really highlighted the difference between his more institutionalist view and Friedman's strict monetarism. Burns thought the rules of the economy had changed. Friedman thought the Fed just wasn't controlling the money supply properly.
Friedman was also warning Nixon about the Bretton Woods system collapsing, right? The fixed exchange rates.
Constantly. He was a huge advocate for floating exchange rates. He thought the fixed system was unsustainable, hindering free trade, causing these recurring balance of payments crises.
And his influence played a role in the eventual shift.
A key role, largely through George Shultz again. Shultz cleverly concocted a floating rate system in the clothing of a par value system.
Meaning?
It was a tactical way to nudge the world towards floating rates without declaring the old system dead immediately. Shultz was so smooth, he apparently even convinced Paul Volcker, who was at Treasury then, that floating rates were Volcker's own idea.
That's some serious bureaucratic maneuvering, shows Friedman's indirect power.
Definitely.
Now, let's talk about Chile, 1975. Probably the most controversial episode of his career.
Without a doubt. He visits Chile during Pinochet's military dictatorship. He was invited by the Chicago Boys, Chilean economists trained at Chicago.
And Chile's economy was in chaos.
Hyperinflation, we're talking 10 to 20% a month. Just devastating.
And Friedman's advice?
Shock treatment.
Yeah.
No gradualism. Drastic cuts in government spending. Stop printing money immediately. He believed you had to break the inflationary fever quickly and decisively.
But the backlash was enormous.
Massive international backlash. Critics accused him of economic genocide, linking his ideas directly to the severe recession and human suffering that followed those policies.
How did Friedman respond?
He felt he was facing liberal McCarthyism. He argued that painful contraction was the necessary, expected price of reducing inflation. It starkly highlights the real-world costs and trade-offs of his radical ideas and his unwavering belief in them, even when the consequences were brutal.
A very difficult chapter. Meanwhile, in the UK, Margaret Thatcher was rising, also influenced by Friedman.
Deeply influenced. She led the monetarist wing of the Conservative Party, determined to tame inflation and roll back the welfare state using his ideas.
Did he advise her directly?
Yes. His advice included things like removing exchange controls, consistent with his free market principles.
How did monetarism work out in practice in Britain?
It proved diabolical in practice, as one observer put it. The policies led to a much deeper recession than intended. It really showed the gap between clean economic theory and messy political reality.
The famous quote was, "Though we were trying to do Friedman, we were actually doing Hayek."
Exactly, implying the immediate painful adjustments associated more with Hayek's vision of market disruption rather than Friedman's smoother theoretical models. It shows implementing these ideas is never simple.
Okay, let's move into the 1980s, the Reagan era, another big test for Friedman's ideas.
A huge test. Reagan comes into office, very much influenced by Friedman's mantra. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon.
And Paul Volcker is now Fed chair, facing double-digit inflation.
Right. Volcker takes over in '79, second oil shock, CPI over 11%. He makes this dramatic shift. He starts targeting monetary aggregates, M1, M2, just like Friedman advocated.
Why? Was Volcker a pure monetarist?
Not necessarily, but he echoed Friedman's insight that, fundamentally, people don't need an advanced degree in economics to understand that inflation has something to do with too much money. It was about credibility, breaking inflation expectations.
But the cost was high.
Extremely high. Interest rates soared, triggering a very severe recession in the early '80s. Necessary, perhaps, to kill inflation, but very painful.
Friedman's views on deficits were also evolving around then. He started supporting tax cuts, even if they created deficits.
Yeah, this is interesting. He moved towards backing supply-side cuts like Kemp-Roth, even with the deficit risk. His logic shifted slightly. He started arguing that tax cuts were the best way to force spending cuts, later starve the beast, essentially.
So less focus on balanced budgets per se, more on shrinking government spending overall.
Pretty much. And at the same time, you had financial deregulation, like repealing Regulation Q, which capped bank interest rates.
Unleashing market forces further.
Exactly. Interest rates hit that shocking figure of 22% in 1981, a perfect storm of tight money and deregulation.
But then came the twist. Volcker eventually backed away from those strict money targets.
He did in 1982. Financial innovation was making M1 and M2 too unreliable. The relationship with the economy was breaking down. Velocity was becoming unpredictable.
And Friedman's reaction.
He declared the monetarist experiment a failure. Predicted inflation would come roaring back.
But it didn't.
Nope. Inflation kept falling. The economy rebounded strongly. Reagan got the political credit. Volcker had licked inflation for basically 40 years, even though he ultimately deviated from this strict Friedmanite rulebook.
It suggests maybe the core insight about controlling money mattered, but the specific mechanism was less rigid than Friedman thought?
Perhaps. Or maybe Volcker's credibility itself became the key anchor, regardless of the specific target. It's complex.
The late 80s, early 90s, fall of the Berlin Wall, collapse of the Soviet Union, this seemed like a vindication for Friedman's ideas globally.
Well, absolutely. Capitalist triumphalism was the phrase. Leaders in Eastern Europe like Václav Klaus in the Czech Republic openly embraced Friedman. Mongolia planned a statue.
And the Washington Consensus became the global standard.
Pretty much. Free trade, privatization, deregulation, these became the default policy prescriptions promoted by international institutions, often with bipartisan support in the U.S.
Financial deregulation continued too, like repealing Glass-Steagall in '99.
Right, dismantling more of those New Deal-era barriers between commercial and investment banking. It all fit the broader trend towards what we now call the neoliberal order.
But looking back now in the 21st century, how are Friedman's ideas holding up? Monetarism seems to have hit some bumps.
Definitely. That financial innovation became its Achilles heel. Defining and controlling money got really hard.
Leading economists to look elsewhere.
Yeah, people like Michael Woodford start talking about monetary policy without money, focusing just on managing interest rates. Even the dominant New Keynesian economics incorporates Friedman's ideas like rational expectations. But it's not pure monetarism.
Did Friedman himself acknowledge these issues?
He did. In 2003, he admitted, quite frankly, the use of quantity of money as a target has not been a success. A major concession.
Yet paradoxically, another of his ideas had a resurgence. The helicopter drop.
Isn't that wild? His purely abstract 1969 thought experiment, imagine dropping money from a helicopter to boost the economy, suddenly became relevant.
How?
Ben Bernanke, before he was Fed chair, speculated about using something like it if interest rates hit zero and deflation was a threat. Got him the nickname Helicopter Ben.
And then during the COVID pandemic.
We saw unprecedented quantitative easing and direct payments to people, essentially a real-world, if messy, version of the helicopter drop concept. Shows how even his theoretical ideas could resurface in unexpected crises.
Let's talk about fairness and inequality. Critics often say Friedman just didn't care about those things.
That's a common charge, but it's maybe an oversimplification. It ignores his lifelong advocacy for the negative income tax, which aimed to provide a basic income floor.
Which influenced later policies.
Absolutely. Things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, e-TICs, and parts of the Child Tax Credit have roots in that NIT concept. It also ignores his strong opposition to things like professional licensing.
Which he saw as barriers protecting insiders.
Exactly. barriers blocking small players, limiting opportunity, and his opposition to the military draft, favoring an all-volunteer force based on choice.
So while he wasn't an egalitarian pushing for equal outcomes,
No, definitely not. He consistently argued that capitalism and free trade were the only systems that had historically lifted the masses out of grinding poverty. That was his primary focus, overall prosperity through freedom.
did he ever acknowledge downsides like rising inequality from globalization?
Interestingly, late in life, he did concede that liberalized trade and technology also threatened advanced countries, hinting at some of the new dynamics of inequality we see today. A little nuance there at the end.
Ultimately, though, his influence is undeniable, isn't it? His way of thinking became almost foundational.
So foundational that his influence is felt across the political spectrum, sometimes even implicitly. There's this anxiety of influence where even his critics operate within a framework he helped build. That's the mark of the profound shift he engineered in that neoliberal order.
So, wrapping up, we've explored Milton Friedman not just as an economist, but as someone who really championed a whole philosophy of freedom.
Yeah, a philosophy that undeniably reshaped global economic thought and policy in massive ways. From his early days in Rahway through his academic battles to advising presidents and prime ministers.
His ideas journeyed from the absolute fringe to the very mainstream, constantly challenging the status quo, pushing for radical change based on his principles.
And his legacy is just so complex, isn't it? Full of contradictions, brilliant insights, alongside predictions that didn't pan out. Celebrated by legions, fiercely condemned by others, but impactful, undeniably.
His core belief, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, was like gospel for central banks for decades.
It really was. Yet today, we're wrestling with inflation that seems more complex, maybe driven by supply shocks, geopolitics, fiscal policy too. It forces us to ask if that simple monetarist explanation is still sufficient.
So, the final provocative thought for you, our listener, what stands out to you from this deep dive into Friedman?
Yeah, how might his enduring insights about individual liberty, about the power of markets, about the crucial role of money, how might they still shape our understanding of today's economy? Even as totally new ideas and challenges emerge to tackle the really pressing issues we face right now.
Something to think about. Keep asking those deep questions.